Hi, I'm Ted Pattison. I'm a developer and a Microsoft MVP focused on Power BI and the Power Platform. I also write and teach classes for Critical Path Training. In this video, we're going to look at taking advantage of the app-only authentication support that's just recently been added to Power BI Embedding. Is this important? Yes, absolutely. Soon, what I'm going to show you is going to be the best practice when developing with the app-owns data model. I'll begin by covering the important fundamentals of how app-only authentication works in Power BI. We're then going to take a deeper look at the service principle behind the Azure AD application that you create. We'll then walk through the details of configuring your Power BI tenant with support for app-only authentication. And then we'll talk about, once you get your app-only access token, how do you write code to actually interact with the Power BI service with an app-only identity. Let's begin by reviewing the fundamentals of Power BI Embedding. When you create a new project that you're developing with Power BI Embedding, you have to choose between first-party embedding and third-party embedding. First-party embedding is what Microsoft refers to as the user-owns data model. All users require a Power BI license. Whether that's the Power BI Pro license or the free license depends on whether your content, your dashboards and reports are inside of a dedicated capacity or not. But the idea is that as your code interacts with the Power BI service, it does so with an access token created for the current user. And that access token created by Azure AD is what we pass back to the browser. Now, the second style of embedding, and the one that's the focus of our talk here, is what we refer to as third-party embedding, or what Microsoft calls the app-owns data model. So this is where your application is able to talk directly to the Power BI service without requiring a license on behalf of any user. And so this has become very popular with ISVs and people who are creating customer-facing applications. Now, what's happened in the past is that third-party embedding has used a master user account, and now we're switching over to use app-only authentication. Now, remember that your code, when it talks to the Power BI service, is going to use a single app identity, no matter who the user is. And the other important note is that when we connect to the Power BI service with a powerful identity, such as in the past with the master user account, or now with the app-only identity, we don't take that access token and pass it back to the browser because of the security surface area it would create for an attacker. So instead, we create a much more constrained security token, which is called the Power BI Embed token. Now, the big picture, if you're using third-party embedding, is that a user connects to your application. If you're using third-party embedding, you and your application have the responsibility of authenticating the user and determining which users have more permissions than other users. But also, you're going to interact with Azure AD to acquire an access token. And in the past, we've been using a master user account to perform this authentication to get a user-based token. Now, when we connect with Azure AD to get an access token, it's going to be an app-only token. Now, once we get the app-only token, we'll interact with the Power BI service. And what we'll see is that you're going to be able to enumerate through the resources of an app workspace, such as to get a list of the data sets and reports and the dashboards. And so when you want to embed a particular resource, like a report or a dashboard, what we need to do is return data back to the browser about that particular resource. So we'll call into the Power BI Service API, and we'll get things for our report, such as the GUID, which identifies the report, and the embed URL. I also have to call into the Power BI service to get an embed token. And the idea is the embed token is the security credentials that allows the embedding to occur on the client site. Finally, we write a little JavaScript code on the client, which takes the embedding data for the report or dashboard and the embed token, and it initializes a session back to the Power BI service. And at that point, your application can drop out of the picture because you now have an embedded report. So let's review the technique we've been using for third-party embedding, which I now call a legacy technique. Okay, maybe it's not legacy now, but as soon as what we're looking at here with the app-only support comes out of preview, it will be a legacy technique. But what's happened is that you create code where the app authenticates as a master user account. Now this creates a couple different issues. First of all, you have to create the master user account. Are you going to use some human beings account, or are you just going to create a daemon account? But someone has to create the Azure AD account. Someone has to add it as an admin to the app workspace. And that master user account, whether a human is associated with it or not, requires a Power BI Pro license. Add to that the app has to authenticate with the user-based identity, which creates various issues in Azure AD. If you talk to the Azure AD team, they'll say never do this unless you have to. Unfortunately, we've had to do this in the past, but there are issues such as that user-based identity has to consent to having its permissions used to access Power BI, and there are cases where you try to obtain an access token without some type of interactive flow, and it fails because the user hasn't granted permission. So what we're going to do is we're going to move to this new best practice for third-party embedding. And it's going to involve the app authenticating as itself. The app is going to have a password or some type of certificate. It can go through a simple server-to-server call to authenticate and require an access token which establishes its app-only identity. Now the app service principal then has to be added as an admin to the app workspace where the content lives. And one of the things that you're going to see is that while it might not be overly intuitive, there are no Azure AD application permissions that are required for you to configure. In fact, if you configure them, they can't be used. Okay, let's finish up this introductory section by talking about how app-only authentication works at a high level. First of all, everything that we're going to do is going to require the new V2 style app workspace. You're not going to be able to use the older style. Now, every Azure AD application has a service principal behind it. And that service principal is going to be added to your app workspace as an admin. And one of the key points here is that nothing about access control is based on Azure AD permissions. So if your app or your app's service principal creates an app workspace, it's automatically configured as an admin. If you want your app or the app's service principal to be able to connect to an app workspace, then you have to figure out how to add that service principal, as a admin member of the target workspace. Okay, so now we've discussed some of the fundamentals of how the app-only authentication is going to work. Let's now take a deeper look at what is an Azure AD security principal. When you create an Azure AD application, it also creates another security object in the same local tenant known as a service principal. Now, one of the main reasons why this is the case is that an application can be configured as multi-tenant. And instead of having a single security identity that's used across all tenants, they create a service principal object so that the application has a different identity in each and every tenant in which it runs. And even in the case where you only have a single tenant, you still have the service principal object, and it has an object ID. So that's the thing that we have to configure security for. Yes, you say, I understand conceptually, but how do I find this mystical service principal object? So let's go to the Azure AD pane in the Azure portal and create a new Azure AD application. I'll create a new application whose name is App Only Demo App. We'll set it for Web API. It doesn't really matter what I add to the sign-in URI or for a redirect URL because they're not used in App Only authentication. Now I'm going to click on this link here at the bottom right, because when I do that in the Azure portal, it drills down into the service principal pane. And so if I look in properties, I can find the application ID to which the service principal is associated, and also you can get the object ID, which basically is the effective identifier for your service principal. So let's go ahead and take these values, and I'm going to take the values and I'm going to paste them into a Word document because I'm going to need these a little bit later. Also, while we're at it, we're going to create what will effectively be the application's password. We're going to add a key to the application, and notice that if I click on keys, I add a key name and a duration and click save. It creates an application key value that I have a one-time opportunity to copy and paste. And that application key acts as the application's password, or what some people call the app secret. We're going to need that later as well. Now, one thing I want to reinforce is that there's nothing about what we're doing that requires you to configure any permissions. You might be used to going to the required permissions for your Azure AD app and adding delegated permissions for the master user account, it's unnecessary. There's nothing about adding delegated permissions or application permissions that affects anything that we're talking about here. Maybe you're one of those modern folk who are really into PowerShell. So here's an example of using the Azure AD commandlets, and notice that if I take my application name and call get Azure AD Service Principal, I can basically, here I'm going to go ahead and log in so that I can connect. And what you're going to see is that using PowerShell, you can discover the Service Principal object. You can create the Azure AD application. You can do everything here. Let's just kind of make sure that the app ID and the Service Principal object ID match up, and they do. Now, with your newfound understanding of Azure AD Security Principles, let's boldly move ahead into configuring your Power BI tenant with app-only authentication support. Now, we need a little bit more conceptual background before we dive in. When we talk to the Power BI Service API, it's actually spread out into two different APIs, the user APIs and the admin APIs. So the Power BI user APIs, an example would be get groups async. I want to be able to get all the different app workspaces that the current user is configured to be a member of. Now, it provides users with access to app workspaces. The user APIs are also what provides your service principal with access to app workspaces, as long as your app workspaces are configured as the workspace admin. Now, there are also admin APIs. So maybe you're familiar with operations provided by the Power BI Service API, such as get groups as admin, and that will allow you to see every single app workspace regardless of whether the current user has permissions to see it as a member or not. So note that nothing about the current app-only authentication support allows you to use the admin APIs. Currently, it's all about the user APIs. Hopefully that will change sometime in the future, but for the foreseeable future, once again, we're going to be using the user APIs once we get an app-only token. Now, in order for the service principals of your apps to even be able to call into the user APIs, you have to go through a tenant level setup. So in just a second, I'm going to do a demo, and I'm going to go into the Power BI admin portal, into tenant settings, into developer settings, and we're going to enable a certain property which is called allow service principals to use Power BI APIs. And remember, it's only going to be the user APIs, not the admin APIs. Next, we're going to create an Azure AD group, and we're going to add it into the admin portal. And the idea is that you're going to create a security group. Let's just say we create a new security group named Power BI Apps. And then we're going to take the security principles for the apps and we're going to add it to that group. And that effectively makes these service principals have the access they need to call into the user APIs. But once again, your app is going to be constrained by only being able to access workspaces that it's been configured as admin. Now, one other nice thing is that once your service principal has been added to this Azure AD group, it now has the ability to actually create a new app workspace. And if it does that, your app or your service principal will automatically be configured as admin. Now let's step through configuring the tenant. We'll start by going to Azure AD. Nothing up my sleeve. We don't have any existing Azure groups. So we'll go into a PowerShell script and we'll create a new Azure AD group named Power BI Apps. Note it's security enabled, but we don't need it to be mail enabled. Once we've created this new Azure AD group, let's just return back to the portal and refresh and make sure our group's there. Now that we've created this Azure AD group, within the same tenant, we're going to go to Power BI and the Power BI admin portal. We're going to go to tenant settings and go down to the developer settings within the tenant settings. And inside developer settings, there is a setting, allow service principal to use Power BI APIs. So we enable that and we're going to add our group inside there. And so now we've configured the group so that any service principal in the group is going to be given the permissions it needs. Now, what's our next step? Our next step is taking our apps service principal and adding it into that Azure AD group. So let's go ahead and run this script. And notice that there is a Get Azure AD Group Member and also an Add Azure AD Group Member. So this allows me to take the group's GUID, its object ID, and set the rep object ID to the service principal. And so I should be able to confirm by going back to the Azure portal and looking at members that we have indeed added our service security principal to this group. Okay, and now we're finally on into the home stretch to our final section where we can finally talk about writing code and developing with app-only authentication. Now, a little bit of background first. In the past, we've worked with a master user account and we basically acquired a user-based access token. And so to do that, we've had to use the user password credential flow. Generally, that's frowned upon in modern application development because you have to register your Azure AD app as a native app as opposed to a web app. It also requires passing a username and password across the network and is subject to issues such as a need to interact interactively with the user when your call to acquire an access token does not allow for interactive capabilities, so the call just fails. Now, there are two other user-based authentication flows. You can use implicit flow in a single-page application to authenticate the user and get a user-based access token. In cases where you have single-page applications, what would be better for user-based acquisition of an access token would be to use the authorization code flow. Now, all three of these that you see on the screen result in the creation of a user-based access token, not an app-only token. So the flow that we're going to be using is known as client credentials flow. It's going to be something that is fairly easy to code up using the Azure Active Directory Authentication Library. And authentication is going to be based either on an app secret that we're using in this demo, or you can use an app certificate. The advantage of using an X509 app certificate is that it's more secure. Your application has the private key, you register the public key with Azure AD, and it creates the most secure style of app-only authentication. And once again, we're going to keep it simple in this video and just use the easier way, which is to authenticate using the application ID and the app secret. Okay, let's move over into Visual Studio and start developing an application that uses app-only authentication. Now, I could create my demo application as an ASP.NET or an ASP Core application, but what might surprise you is I can also create it as a regular console application or as an Azure function. So because you don't depend on a rely URL to verify that you're at a particular endpoint on the internet, it provides the opportunity to get an app-only token from anywhere you are. So what we're going to do is we'll create a console application. And with this console application, we're going to add a couple of NuGet packages. So first, we will add the NuGet package for the Active Directory Authentication Library, and we'll take the latest version as of February 19, 2019. And once we have done that, next we'll add in the NuGet package for the .NET SDK wrapper for the Power BI Service API. And once we've added that in, now we can start writing the code to acquire an app-only access token. Now, also, let me just go ahead and update the dependent packages that the Power BI SDK added in. So now we're all up to date. Now, I'm going to copy and paste a little starter code. And in this starter code, I have a couple different methods that we're about to walk through. But first, we're going to have to configure application data for authentication. So we'll start by taking the app ID. And remember, that's how the application identifies itself to Azure Active Directory. Next, we take the application secret, which acts as the password. Don't share that. And finally, we need the tenant ID. So I'm going to go back into Azure, into the Azure portal, into the AD, and I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste the OAuth token endpoint for this particular Azure tenant. Now, unlike user-based authentication, you can't use the common endpoint. You have to know ahead of time the GUID for your particular tenant. So the GUID for our tenant is going to have to be integrated into the URL, which we use to authenticate and acquire the access token. So let's go ahead and add that inside there. Now, note that over the next couple lines, I have the authorization root, and then we add the tenant GUID. Next, we have the resource URI for Power BI. That's the identifier when I want to get an access token for the Power BI Service API. Now let's take a second to walk through the method getAppOnlyAccessToken. We start by initializing the authentication context with a tenant-specific endpoint. Next, create a client credential object with the application ID and password, and then call acquire token async. Very simple. You get back the access token, and it's an app-only access token. Now let's look at the first method that actually is going to do something. Create V2 App Workspace. Now note that currently this is not supported with the .NET SDK on top of the Power BI Service API. So we're going to make a direct REST call against the endpoint for the Power BI service. And note that we're going to pass the workspace v2 equals true query string parameter. This is the programming technique you can use to create a v2 app workspace while they're still in preview. Next, let's go ahead and see what the application is going to call. Create v2 app workspace. Let me go ahead and start Fiddler. It's my security blanket. Now let's go ahead and run this very simple application that's going to get an app-only access token and create a new v2 app workspace. Once it runs, let's go back to Fiddler. Back in Fiddler, I can see that we were able to obtain an app-only access token. You can see the credentials that were passed. You can also see the access token coming back. There's a cool little trick where in Fiddler, you can basically send the access token to the text wizard, trim off the authorization equals part at the end, and then you can get the decoded access token. This is just if you're curious. If you're like me and you're curious, it's fun. Might be something that not everyone does. But let's go ahead and I'm going to create just a temporary JSON file in my application because I am curious, and so should you be, at what's inside of this app-only access token. So if I go ahead and paste this in and trim off the top at the end, and I'll go ahead and reformat it, what you can see is that the object ID and the subject, it's the GUID for the service principal. So basically our access token has the service principal, as its identity. Where are the scopes, you might ask? We don't need no stinking scopes. We're not using permissions. Once again, we're just propagating the app identity to Power BI. Now let's inspect the operation that created the v2 app workspace. You can see that the app workspace has been created. So let's go back to Power BI and see if we can see it. I'll go ahead and refresh, and lo and behold, I don't see the app workspace. And that's because it's owned by the service principal. I'm just another user. I've never been given access. So if we go to the Power BI admin portal and go to workspaces, I can find the app workspace there and give my user account access as an admin. Now both the app's service principal and I both have administrative capabilities. Note that in the admin portal, they're not showing today the service principal, but now let's go ahead and open up the app workspace. And now if I go to access, note that I should be able to see the app-only demo app, the service principal, has been added as an admin. Now that I've configured access for myself, a basic user, I can now go through the usual steps of uploading my PBIX file to create the data sets and the reports that I need, and basically growing out the content. Note that any user that's going to be working on the content needs a Power BI Pro license, but note that now that I've started to fill out my app workspace with data sets and reports, I can also create a dashboard. And since my user account and the app's service principal both have been configured as admin, as I add content, all that content is available to my application through the Power BI Service API. Now consider another scenario where you've created a v2 app workspace by hand and the service principal is not automatically the admin. How do you get that to work? So let's go ahead and create a new v2 app workspace. And during the preview period, and this is the end of February, what you'll see is that if I go to the Access tab of a v2 app workspace, it's not going to be able to resolve the service principal. It can resolve an Azure AD group that your service principal is in, but that does not give you the support you need. If I go to the Power BI admin portal and try to add the service principal as an admin, that won't work either as of today. However, this support should be added by the Power BI service team over the next few weeks. But for those of you that can't wait for the UI support, let's see how we can do it through code. Now we're going to use the Power BI Service API, and the catch-22 is we can't use app-only authentication because it only uses the user APIs. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to create a user-based token from an application where we have tenant read-write all permissions. Now, once we've done that, we can get the Power BI client, and now we're going to look at this custom method, which is set app workspace membership. So we start by figuring out what is the GUID for the service principal. So we get that object ID. Then we enumerate through all the workspaces with get groups as admin. Remember, you have to call that with a user token. It's not supported with the app only token. Then what we can do is we can use the typical operation to add group user async. But now what we're going to do, instead of principal type being user or group, it's app. Okay, now that we have the code, let's go back to our main method. Let's comment out what we had there before, and we'll add a new call to set app workspace membership. Okay, hold your horses. Let's go ahead and run the app and see what happens. Okay, so Control F5, we run the program, it runs without any errors. Let's go back to Fiddler, see what happened. So first of all, you can see that I was able to call the as admin function to get back all the different workspaces. And now what we can see is that we're able to make the call into the app workspace and basically set the membership for my app. Now the proof is in the pudding, of course. Let's go back to Power BI. Let's go back to our app workspace, and let's make sure when we look at the Access tab that we see the service principal of our app giving us full access when we use the Power BI Service API. Okay, let's move on from the console app to an ASP.NET app that I created a couple years ago. The Daily Reporter Pro I've updated for Power BI app-only authentication. So we have all the important pieces of data we need in the web.config file. Here inside of the C# code, I basically pull in that data, and we're able to use the client credential flow. And as long as my app has been configured as admin, using the user APIs, it has full access to everything. So we'll go ahead and start up this application just to give it a quick test drive. Note that your application can discover all the reports and the dashboards in the current app workspace. Let's go ahead and go into edit mode, and note that we can update the report, and that update will be sent back, and the report gets updated by my custom application. Now also, the service principal doesn't have to do all the content authoring work. A user with a Power BI Pro license can go back to the app workspace as long as he or she has permissions and make changes. So let's say we add a new report, report 2, and let's make a quick change. So let's say that I go in and change the colors for male and female. We better not do perpetuate stereotypes for gender, so we'll have men be pink, females be blue. Let's go ahead and save my change. Let's go back, refresh, and notice that my app can discover the new report, and there's the new report we see. Now that application only showed a small set of what's possible. So when you have an app-only token, what can you do? Well, you can create new app workspaces. You can clone content as long as you have your service principal with access to a source app workspace. You can create a new app workspace and clone the content from one to the other. You can enumerate through the list of data sets or reports or dashboards, and then get the embedding data you need for a dashboard, an existing report, or a new report. Of course, we can generate embed tokens, which is required in the app owns data model. If you want to basically publish content, you're able to upload PBX files, which will create data sets and reports. You can update the connection strings for your data sets and update data source credentials. You can also create and populate streaming data sets and push data sets, which gives you the foundation for creating real-time dashboards. Now, what did we learn today? Well, let's kind of take a step back. So we have this new app-only authentication support, and it's now in preview. So what we saw is that your application acquires an app-only access token using client credentials, and it takes on the identity of the application's service principal. Now, once you have a Power BI resource that you want to access, all access is controlled by adding the service principal to the workspace membership as an admin. And note that nothing about this is going to give permissions based on Azure Active Directory permissions. So basically, Power BI administrators have full control, over who can see what. Now, app-only tokens provide access to the user APIs. So once again, your application can't go fishing and discover what are the different app workspaces in the current tenant. Someone has to give it permissions, and the one exception is if your service principal creates a new app workspace, it's automatically seen as the admin. Okay, let's finish up with a call to action. So why is app-only authentication support important? It eliminates the need to create a master user account and give it a Power BI Pro license. It eliminates the need to use what we're trying to move away from, which is the user password credential flow, and just a set of issues associated with an application authenticating under a user-based identity. So what are the recommendations for developers who are using the app owns data model? So as soon as you can, migrate away from using the master user account to this app-only authentication support. Now also, in this demo, I showed you kind of the easy path, which is to use an app secret. And that's fine to get up and going in the development phase, but we'd also recommend that before you move to production, that you go to a more secure authentication scheme, which involves creating an X509 certificate, and then basically publishing the public key with Azure and having the private key PFX file that your application is able to extract the private key from at runtime. Okay, and then lastly, keep your secrets secret. If someone discovers your app secret or your client certificate, remember there's no reply URL which basically says your code has to be running from a certain place on the internet. That's only with user-based authentication. So whoever has your secret can basically get an app-only access token. And now let's finish up with a quick word from our sponsor, Critical Path Training. So at Critical Path Training, we have hands-on training classes. You can attend either in person or remotely. We're running a series of developing with Power BI embedding workshops. In May, we're going to have a one-day workshop, 7 hours of drilling down and having you start writing lots of code. We also have a 4-day Power BI developer bootcamp, which covers Power BI embedding, custom visuals, and a set of other development techniques for Power BI. We also have Power BI certification bootcamp if you're not into the development thing, but you want to really understand the Power BI platform from the standpoint of a builder and an administrator. We have all the information you need to pass the certification exam. If you're looking for mentoring or consulting services, maybe we can help you with that too. So if you have assistance with Power BI embedding development or custom visual development, you like an architecture review, you want some assistance getting some help with a proof of concept application, go ahead and reach out and contact us, and we'll see if we can help you. So more information available at www.criticalpathtraining.com. If we take a quick look over here, notice that I can come down. Let's take a look at the Power BI Developer Bootcamp, and you can get the details for the courses here. So thanks very much for listening to this video. I hope you learned a whole bunch about app-only authentication with Power BI.